It is good to see each and every one of you. I am so happy to be here with you on this Easter Thursday. So today we are at our penultimate lecture. We're here in the fourth unit, and as you recall, the purpose of the fourth unit is to bring everything together and to talk about the two markets that matter most to all of our well-being. The first of those is the labor market. So today we're going to review briefly what we did on Tuesday, and then we are going to try to see the answer to a very crucial question. It's an answer that's a question that's related to the work that I do and the work that most of the economists at Notre Dame do. And the question is there any evidence for any of this? So we've got great theories, and by great they seem plausible. Maybe they seem to work in very specific places, with very specific tests. But do we have any good evidence that these theories are generally important about what happens in our lives, in the economy? That's what we're going to try to start answering today. And it'll take us all the way to when we get to our final market next Tuesday. So let's start with a prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Heavenly Father, thank you for giving us the gift of another day of being alive. Help us to be grateful for everything that you've given us. Help us to trust in you always. Please bless these students. Help them to finish well what they have begun well. Help them to trust in you, and help all of us always to help each other, especially those most in need. We ask this through your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Together we pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. So, where does our pay rate come from? Where does all the variation and why some of us get paid one thing and some of us get paid another? Where does that come from? We're going to review the basics of our predictions, and then we're going to move on to asking, is any of this really true? So to review the basics of our predictions, suppose we have the following situation again. Suppose that as a firm changed the number of workers working together to produce the products, we saw the following changes to quantity of output. As we move from 0 workers to 1, to 2, to 3, to 4, to 5, we have something like this going on with quantity of output. 0, 10, 18, 24, 28, 30. If that occurred, then what we could see is that the marginal product of labor, the MPL, was clearly decreasing. The marginal product of the first person was 10. The marginal product of the second person was what? Third person? Fourth person? Fifth person. Okay, good. So if there was some sort of price of output that stayed constant at $2, no matter how much or how little quantity of product we produce, what kind of output market are we in of the 4 major types of markets? Excellent, good job. Okay, so in that case, our perfectly competitive output market means that the value of the marginal product of labor is just that constant $2 price times the marginal product of labor. VMPL, the value of the marginal product of labor, is the price of the output times MPL, the marginal product of labor. So then we're left with 20 for the first guy, 16 for the second, 12 for the third, 8 for the fourth, and 4. Okay. So far, so good. What do we notice about that BMPL? If we were to graph it, it would have the following shape. Here's our quantity of labor on the x-axis. Here's our wage or things in dollars on the y-axis. Our VMPL would be downward sloping. What else do we notice about it? Well, suppose the wage was $12. If the wage was $12, then it's worth it for the firm to hire one worker because that first worker brings in 20 and only costs 12. Again, if the wage is $12, it would also be worth it for the firm to hire a second worker, because the second worker brings in an additional 16 and only costs 12. Finally, if the wage is $12, the firm can just break even by also hiring that third worker, because that third worker brings in 12 and costs 12. So in equilibrium, we would expect that a profit-maximizing firm, if the wage was 12, would hire 3 workers. That's like taking a wage of $12 here, intersecting it with the VMPL, and going down to the QL axis and seeing that the quantity of workers is 3. That means that the VMPL curve is a what curve? It's a demand curve, and it's the demand for labor. So it's the labor demand curve. The VMPL curve is the labor demand curve. Okay, what else did we learn? We also learned that if everyone is bargaining on the margin for their wage, then whenever you're bargaining on the margin, you are the marginal worker. So regardless of whether you're the first person this firm hired, the second person this firm hired, or the third person this firm hired, once the firm has 3 people and you're thinking about leaving, what you would do to the number of workers is reduce them from 3 to what? 2. So you are, by virtue of the act of considering leaving the firm, by virtue of the act of bargaining for a wage and being willing to walk away if you don't get the wage you want, you are now the marginal worker. That means that the most you can expect the firm to do is to give you what you're offering the firm. Well, if you're the third worker, the marginal worker, in a 3-worker firm, and your marginal product is 6, and the price of the output is 2, and the value of your marginal product is $12 an hour, what's the most you can expect the firm to ever pay you per hour? $12. So, in fact, what we would expect if there's lots of good bargaining going on, and workers are able to bargain effectively, is that they would be paid their value of marginal product of labor. The equilibrium wage, W star, will equal the value of marginal product of labor of the Q star employee. The equilibrium wage will be the value of marginal product of labor of the Q star employee, QL star. So in this case, the equilibrium wage would be the value of marginal product of labor of the third worker, which is 12. So how much would the third worker get paid? $12 an hour. How much would the second worker also get paid? How much would the first worker get paid? Exactly. Okay, so everybody will be paid the value of marginal product of labor of the QL star employee. Well, then our big question is, how can we improve our wage? In order to improve our wage, if this model is true, we have to improve the value of marginal product of labor of the QL star employee in our production process. Well, there's 2 things, again, I erased it, but I'll add it again. There are 2 things that are in the value of marginal product of labor of the QL star employee. One is the price of the output, and the other is the marginal product of labor of the QL star employee. Both of those things, both the price, which is probably telling us something about the quality of the good in question, and the marginal product of labor, which is telling us something about the rate at which we produce per hour, so quantity. Both the quality and the quantity, as represented by the price and the marginal product, are probably affected by education and technology. The more education that we have, the better quality products we can potentially do, whether that education is formal education, or as we saw last time, education that comes from increases in our experience. And likewise, if we're using technology, then in fact, that technology can sometimes improve both the quality of what we produce and the quantity, as I know you've experienced with certain recent innovations that have come out regarding AI. Okay, both of those, education and technology, have embedded within them another good that's very important. What is that other good that makes education and technology effective? Go ahead. Knowledge. Now, is knowledge a rival good? No. Is knowledge an excludable good? No. Is it a private good? No. What kind of good is it? Public. It's a public good. Do markets do a good job of producing the right amount of public goods? No. They don't. So I want you to keep that in mind. Keep in mind that the thing that makes pay happen is just the law of diminishing marginal product that we just showed. But the thing that makes pay happen well is a public good. Now, keep that in mind. And keep in mind, throughout today's lecture and throughout Tuesday's lecture, the fact that public goods don't necessarily arrive at the optimal rate when we depend on markets to produce them for us. Okay, now, we claimed that people tend to all get paid the same wage, that being the wage of the value of marginal product of labor of the perfectly substitutable workers who are just like them. We also claim that that wage will likely go up and down with respect to things that affect that value of marginal product of labor, such as, plausibly, education. Finally, if we see things that are affecting the wage that aren't education, that would mean either they're affecting the VMPL, or if they're not affecting the VMPL, something's going wrong in our markets. What's one thing that can go terribly wrong? An injustice that can happen in labor markets. Starts with a D. Discrimination. So you could have discrimination in a labor market. That would be an effect on the wage that not only does not come through the VMPL, but does come through something that's very unjust. It's not going through the VMPL, and it is coming through something that's unjust. So that's our theory of the things that can affect your wage. Do we have any evidence for this? Well, yes, we do, in fact. It turns out that economists, like the economists that work at most universities today, including Notre Dame, often look at empirical evidence, or evidence from data. And they've gotten pretty good, at least sometimes, at looking at that evidence in a way that creates a body of knowledge that's consistent across different contexts, that's precise, and that explains certain patterns in our economy very effectively. So today I want to start sharing how we do that, and some of it happens here at Notre Dame. I'll share some of it from an economist at my alma mater. I'll share another from an economist right here at Notre Dame. So we'll talk about how they do it, and we'll start talking about what they found, and we'll evaluate the theories we just learned about. So suppose you had the following situation. Suppose you wanted to find out the effect of Tylenol on headaches. And you said, I'm going to do an amazing study of Tylenol on headaches. I'm going to take a random sample of 50 of the students in this 153-person classroom, and I'm going to ask each of them 2 questions. First question, did you have a headache last week? Second question, did you take Tylenol last week? Now suppose you did that and you took a random sample and it was a legitimate randomization of people. Okay, so it's just a random sample of the class. 50 people, about a third of the class. You asked them those 2 questions, and then you looked at the results and you very excitedly came back to class, the next class time, and you said, guys, listen, professor, everybody, fellow students, look what I found. I found that people who had headaches last week were way more likely to have reported having taken Tylenol last week than the people who didn't have headaches. I have proved that Tylenol causes headaches. I'm a hero. This is amazing. Would you find that evidence convincing? Most people said no. We'll go with the no, but God bless you. Okay? So let's think about that, right? Yeah, we took a legitimate random sample, but we didn't do the randomizing that we would want. What's the randomizing we would have wanted? Would it just have been taking a random sample, or is there another type of randomizing we would have wanted to do? What's the other type of randomizing we would have wanted to go ahead? Right! We would have wanted to have not just a random sample, but a randomized controlled trial, or RCT. We would want to control the variation in who got Tylenol. Not letting people experience whatever they experience, do whatever they do, and then report what they did and just analyze the so-called ecological variation that naturally arose in this setting. We wouldn't want to do just that. If we wanted to do just that, we would have asked a lot more questions. What are the other questions we would have had to ask? Like, when did you take the Tylenol? Did you take it before the headache? Did you have the headache first? After you took the Tylenol, what happened to the headache? Right? If we'd asked enough questions about the ecological variation, we probably could have come up with the right answer either way. But with those two questions, we wouldn't want to use ecological variation. We would want a randomized, controlled trial. So we would randomize who got the Tylenol, who didn't. Probably we want to do that for everybody, both the people who had headaches and the people who didn't. And then we would see if you had a headache and randomly got assigned to Tylenol versus your otherwise similar friend who also had a headache but randomly got assigned to placebo. Did the Tylenol reduce the headache? Or increase it? Or nothing? So that's what we would have wanted to do. Well, the lessons I just shared, both on the number of questions you ask and the detail of the questions, and on the controlled variation. Randomization is a good way to control variation, in this case, in Tylenol use. Those lessons, asking detailed questions and/or controlling variation, are at the heart of everything I'm about to show you. They're at the heart of the fact that over the last 200 years, economists have been able to move beyond stating theories to actually testing them and learning something about them. And that process of theorizing, testing, then going back and theorizing again, then testing again and again and again, it's resulted in a conversation in the field of economics that has actually solved some issues for us. And this is a conversation that you yourselves can participate in. There's many ways you'd be able to participate in what I'm about to show you today. So first, let's get to it, and then later I'll talk to you about how you can yourselves participate in this if you wish. So, first question, is there any evidence for the most important hypothesis, which is that everybody gets paid the value of their marginal product of labor as the marginal employee? Yeah, there is. How do people test this? Innumerable ways. Let me share one test that I'm familiar with. A friend of mine has access to information about all of the firms in the United States and access to information about all of the deaths in the United States. He merged that information together, he's a fellow economist, and he focused on the deaths that were, as you might have guessed from what I just said in the Tylenol thought experiment, quasi-random. For instance, somebody who got hit by a truck unexpectedly. So this is not a person who was expected to die. This is not someone that the firm in question could have prepared for their death. The person in question could have prepared for it. It was just totally unexpected. Well, then what did he do? He looked at the change in revenues that American firms experience when one of their employees randomly dies. Now, if this theory is true, that employees actually participate in producing useful things on average, then probably what happened to the revenues of the typical American firm when one of their employees randomly died? Did it go up, stay constant, or decrease? Decrease. And in the language of this model, the amount that the revenues decreased by when they randomly lost one marginal employee would have been called what? The VMPL. So he looked at a measurement, an empirical data measurement of the dollars of VMPL of various employees in the United States when they randomly passed away. Then he just looked at what? He also has information on everybody's pay. So he looked at the pay of those employees. Now, do you think that the pay was wildly different than the VMPL, like 10% or 510%? Or do you think it was pretty similar to the VMPL? What do you think? Yeah, exactly. In fact, the typical employee across the US, just the raw pay is about 85% of their VMPL. But the employees that are bargaining regularly, because they change jobs fairly frequently, they're not just sort of staying in the same job forever and potentially stuck there. Those employees who are kind of at the cusp of what they can get by truly bargaining, their pay is well into the 90% of their VMPL. So the typical American worker in a well-functioning labor market like America's, that typical American worker is getting paid roughly their VMPL. Okay, that's good, and we have other evidence for that as well. That's just one study, but this is representative of, I think, what you find by looking at the literature. What about how to change our pay, though, and improve it? After all, we have a theory of what the VMPL is. Our theory says the VMPL is price of output times MPL, and that both of those are likely affected by things that can affect quality and or quantity rate of your output. And one of our chief hypotheses is that education might actually be one of the things that affects that. Now, we looked at ecological variation last time. We looked at the Hamilton Project, run by the Brookings Institution, and we saw two things. First of all, over the course of your life cycle, people of a given level of education, as they increase the number of years they're in the labor force, as they increase the number of years they're working, what tends to happen to their salary? It increases. So that's consistent with knowledge gained through experience, which is a type of on-the-job education, being influential for their BNPL. But we also found that people with higher levels of education earned what? Lower pay or higher pay? Right, so we saw that high school graduates earned less than people with associate's degrees. People with associate's degrees earn less than people with bachelor's degrees. People with just a random bachelor's degree earn less than people with, say, a management degree. Going up in the education ladder, people with a management degree earn less than people with an economics degree. I should say more left. Okay. And people with an economics degree earn less than people with really intense levels of education who often get graduate degrees, such as engineers. Okay, so is that evidence as high quality as the evidence we said we wanted from the Tylenol thought experiment? What do we want from the Tylenol thought experiment? Really high quality evidence. Would you say that that's sufficiently high quality? I wouldn't. Can anyone think of some objections to the evidence I just shared? Why might that not be sufficient evidence that education improves your pay through improving your BNPL? Go ahead.
Could be external factors.
Yeah.
In addition to just like major role of education that go with those groups.
Exactly. Other external or third factors that go with those groups. It could be that the kind of people that get management degrees instead of just a high school diploma are also different in other ways than their level of education. And if they're different in other ways than their level of education, it could be those other ways that are affecting their pay. Maybe people who get management degrees are more driven than people who just get a high school diploma. And if that's the case, then maybe it's the fact that they're more driven that causes them to get higher pay. So what would we need? Again, we would need something not like the first Tylenol example, but like the second. We need to control the variation in education. How would we do that? Well, it turns out there's probably 1,000 good empirical studies in the effect of education on wages. And by good, I mean that they have plausible evidence of the causal effect of an additional year of education on wages. How do they do it? With quasi-random variation. A host of strategies where two otherwise similar people, for some sort of policy quirk, end up getting different levels of education. The policy quirks could be policies about when you're allowed to quit school relative to your birthday. The policy quirks could be a host of other policy changes that subtly affect people so that two otherwise similar people end up with a year of different education. What do you think this literature has found across 1,000 studies of the causal impact of education on wages? Do you think it's positive, zero, or negative? Positive, it has. We have really good evidence that the causal effect of an additional year of education on wages is positive. What do you think it is per year? One more year of education, you and an otherwise similar person, you have one more year of education than the otherwise similar person. What do you think that does on average to your increases by how much? 10%, that's correct. It's approximately 10%. If you look at this roughly 1,000 studies, it'll be ranging anywhere from, say, 6% to 13%. I would say the median estimate across these 1,000 studies is roughly 10%. So what would the wage premium be for going to 4 years of college versus not? Roughly what? No, 4 years of college.
Or 4 years.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. So the two otherwise similar people, someone who completes 4 years of college versus someone who doesn't, it's plausible the person completing 4 years of college may get up to 40% more in salary per year. Okay, so we have lots of evidence of that. But do we find that everything is so simple, do you think? Do you think that we find that there are no quirks and difficulties? No. So unfortunately, the labor market isn't necessarily as simple as we all get paid our value of marginal product of labor And we all also end up being able to influence our marginal product of labor through education and experience. Sometimes there are strange patterns. One strange pattern that I think is important to look at is the gender pay gap. Anybody tell us what the gender pay gap is? Go ahead.
Gap in median wage between men and women.
Yeah, it's a gap in typical wages, however that's measured, median need, between men and women. And often it's men and women with similar backgrounds. So if you take men and women who both have the same level of education, they both have the same age, the only thing that differs measurably is their gender, you'll often find that those men and women have different wages and the men have higher wages. Furthermore, you'll often find that even if they have the same education, age, experience, and the same industry they're working in, and the same rough occupational category, they often have different pay. So the big question is, where does this gender pay gap come from? And is it possible to use the kind of causal economics that I just extolled to answer that question? If it is possible to use that kind of causal economics to answer that question, does that then give us insight into what policies could help solve the gender pay gap? Let's go on that adventure together and see if we can figure it out. So now I want to introduce some work that I think was really pioneered, I would say, by the economist Claudia Golden, who teaches at my alma mater, and she just got the Nobel Prize for this work and others a couple years ago. And an interesting aside, I would think that 6 economists that I've spent these last 2 lectures of the course over the last 17 years focusing on in terms of their work, 6 of those economists I think have gone on to win Nobel Prizes since I've started doing it. I don't think that's possible. I think that's just a correlation. But interestingly, she's recently gotten the Nobel Prize for this work, and I want to share with you some of her insights. What did she do? Well, working with various co-authors, she did the following. She decided to get data from a leading business school. I think I know which leading business school it is, but since this is being recorded, I won't tell you. But economists talk on the grapevine. But officially, this leading business school shared the data under the assumption of anonymity, the promise of anonymity. And so this leading business school shared data on its MBAs. What kind of data did it share? Really detailed data, like the kind of questions I was suggesting you ask of your Tylenol people if you weren't able to randomly assign the Tylenol pills. The kind of questions where you say, well, when did you take the Tylenol? How did you feel right before you took it? Did anything change in the first 3 hours after you took the Tylenol, etc.? Really detailed questions. Well, you can ask that of the career pasts, career histories, educational work, and future career outcomes of these MBA graduates at a leading MBA program. They ask questions like, what grades did you get? What courses did you study before you went to the MBA? What did you specialize in educationally before you got this MBA? Then they know that all of them were selected for this prestigious MBA program, so already they're in a selected pool that's all similar to each other. During the MBA program, they know what courses they took, they know how they did in those courses. After the MBA program, they know the industry you worked in. They know the occupational job title that you had. They know your pay. They know the number of hours of work. They know if you took any time off of work. They know why you took time off of work, if you did take time off of work. They know all of those things for years of your career life. This is really detailed data. The results I'm going to show you ended up being sufficiently persuasive that they've informed policy and earned a Nobel Prize, at least taken in the context of an overall literature. This is just one of the early papers in it. But none of the early literature involved actual quasi-random variation. And so that's important to know. You can, if you ask enough detailed questions, you can do transformative work even without a randomized controlled trial. So let me share some of this with you. Here are the male and female mean, median, and 90th percentile annual salaries in 2006 dollars by years since the MBA. So 0 years since the MBA is the year you got your MBA in this sample. And then they're following these people 13 years out on an annual basis. Now, look how close the male median and female median are in year 0. They're close in year 0. Are they equally close in year 13? No. What happened? Did the gap expand or narrow? Yeah, so overall, whether you look at medians or means, what happened to the gap? Did it expand or narrow? Expanded. Okay, so the first thing they note with this data is that these people are exceptionally similar to each other as of year 0. They had similar enough life histories that they were all accepted into the same very selective MBA programs. Then they all graduated from that MBA program. And in spite of the fact that there's a great deal of ex-ante similarity in these people, the gap widens a great deal between their pay, starting from year 0 onward. That's the first thing to know. Now, you might be asking, these are just plots of the means and medians. There's a lot of variation here. Maybe the data is so fuzzy that there's no significant difference. Well, what we mean by significant difference in these empirical studies is statistically significant difference. And that's where we look not only at something like a mean or a median, but we look at the spread around it. And if that spread around two means is similarly that spread overlaps enough, then that means the means are actually kind of similar, even though they look different. So you gotta have statistically significant differences to learn anything in empirical work. Well, here what you can see is that every year, from year 0 all the way to year 10 or greater, there are statistically significant differences. Every year, there are statistically significant differences in the annual earnings, the log annual earnings, the cumulative years not working, other information about how much you're working between men and women in the sample. Every year there are differences. And you can tell that by looking at the numbers in brackets under each number on this chart. Each number on this table has a number in brackets underneath it. The number in brackets, without using any technical terms, is telling you something about how spread the data is around that number on top of it. And if that number in brackets is sufficiently small relative to the number on top of it, they put some stars there to focus your eyes on it so you see that in fact this is a fairly precisely estimated number. These are very precisely estimated numbers. What you can see is not only that every year is there a gap between men and women's pay, but what's happening to that gap? Is it staying the same or is it growing? It's growing. Now, this is a useful table. It not only has information about annual earnings, it also has information about other things, like cumulative years not working, etc. What about cumulative years not working? There is a statistically significant difference, but is it big or small in year 0? Okay, so men and women are kind of roughly have the same amount of investment in the labor force in terms of years working or not working in year 0. Does that stay the same when you get to year 10? What happens? Does it decrease or increase? It increases. Okay, so men end up having more cumulative years of experience by the time you get to year 10. Okay, and that's true also of annual weeks worked in current year, annual hours worked, etc. Okay, now, what they do now is try to use a technique called multivariate regression to see if they can explain the gap in pay, because they see a lot of other gaps as well. The gap in pay is growing, and it's large. But there's a lot of other gaps that are growing and large as well. Now what they're going to try to do is try to see if they can statistically explain the gap in pay by looking at these other gaps and controlling for them in something called a multivariate regression. Okay, so now the rows of this, columns of this table tell us the number of years since MBA receipt, 0, 1, 3, 6, 9, greater than or equal to 10. With no controls, we see that the gender gap starts at about 8.9%. That's how to read that coefficient up at the top. Negative 0.089 with a very small spread underneath it of 2. That's 8.9%, a negative 8.9% gap between women and men with only a 2%, to not use any technical terms, a 2% spread. So it's very precisely measured. Does the gap stay at 8.9% with no controls? It grows a great deal. So finally, greater than or equal to 10, all these people who got into the same MBA program and graduated from the same MBA program, there's a 56.5% difference in pay between men and women. It's huge by 10 or more. But now they're going to control for things and see if they explain it. Does controlling for pre-MBA characteristics, maybe the men and women who went to this MBA program were different before they joined the MBA program, does that eliminate the growth? All of the growth in the pay gap? No. We still have a pay gap that grows from 8% to 48%. What if you added how they did in the MBA program? Maybe they were focusing on different activities and some of them focused more on their school in the MBA program. Does that explain the whole gap? No, hardly any. What about adding labor market experience? Does that start to explain a little more? A little bit. Yeah, the gap goes from 56.5% to 31% and greater than or equal to 10. What about weekly hours worked? How much they work each week? Does that explain more? Yeah. And then the reasons for choosing jobs and the job setting characteristics, it looks like women and men are choosing different types of jobs within the same categories. They're choosing different hours of work per week, different numbers of leaves over a 10-year period, extended leave, 6 weeks, 6 months off, a year off from work. Okay, different characteristics of the jobs, if you look at a vector of characteristics. Now here's the interesting thing. What they do next is they think about some life events or circumstances that might cause men and women to behave differently. And they see if these gaps only appear when those life circumstances happen. What do you think the life circumstance might be? Any ideas? Go ahead. Someone? Go ahead. Having a kid. Now, takes two, so both men and women are having kids at the same rates. But it would have to be that something different happens to men and women when there's a baby. What would the different thing be? Go ahead. It's more likely that women would take more time off of work than men. So what they do is they look at the small subset of men who do take a lot of time off when they have a kid. And they compare that with women who take a lot of time off when they have a kid. Then they look at the large subset of men who don't take time off when they have a kid and compare it with the small subset of women who don't take time off when they have a kid. Then they find out that there's not a gender pay gap in their data. What exists in their data is a taking time off with kids pay gap. And so what's happening is women are much more likely to take time off when they have kids. But whoever of either gender takes time off when they have kids ends up experiencing slower promotions, fewer exciting work opportunities for promotions, tends to work lower hours, and gets lower pay per hour as a result. Okay, so can we see that in the data? Well, the best papers in economics end up visually getting better over time by inspiring large literatures, which end up producing more and more data. And a lot of the good data today comes from Europe. So let me share some data from a follow-up paper written in 2019 by another set of authors. So let's take a look at this. Okay, here we're comparing men and women, all of whom have a child. They put the year in which they had their first child at year 0. Year 0 is the year they've had the first child. And they're plotting earnings per year from 5 years before the birth of the first child to 20 years after the birth of the first child, for men and women. Hours worked. The probability of participating in the labor force at all. And the pay per hour, the wage rate. Do those look similar for men and women before the birth of the first child? Yes. Do they continue to look similar for men and women after the birth of the first child? No. There's a huge decline. Now that decline in earnings is in part a decline in hours worked and participation in the labor force. But also, even when you control for those, the amount they get paid per hour clearly decreases as well. So they're getting paid less per hour, and they are working fewer hours, and they're less likely to work overall. So, is it plausible that children and the differential effects of children on women are responsible for this gender pay gap? Looking at the timing of where the gap emerges, what would you say? Yeah. Now, did we randomly assign children in this study? No, we didn't. Okay, so this is not quasi-random variation. Nevertheless, even though we didn't randomly assign children in the study, the detailed information is so detailed, so comprehensive. I believe this data set includes every human person in the country of Denmark. It's so extensive that we have really good evidence just from looking at the timing of events that something's going on with children that's causing this. Well, what would happen if we tried to explain the overall pay gap between men and women over time, looking at how much of it emerges from this, and how much of it emerges from everything else? Well, let's see. Looking at figure 5 of this paper, we could look at the child-related gender inequality versus residual or other explained gender inequality. So you could think of residual inequality as the inequality that happens after you've controlled for other plausible explanations. You could think of education-related inequality as the inequality that seems to be explainable by the fact that men and women have different levels of education. You can think of the child-related inequality as the inequality that emerges right after those first child events. If you look at all of that, it's pretty evenly split in 1980. A lot of it's explained by differences in how men and women take time off when they have children. A lot of it's explained by the fact that men have higher education in 1980 than women, and then a lot of it's unexplained. But what happens by 2012? Almost all of it is explained by what? What is it? Child-related. So today, if you look at developed nations today, almost all of the differences in pay between men and women are related to the fact that something happens when men and women have children and they respond differentially to it. Namely, what happens is men are less likely to take time off to care for the child. Women are more likely to take time off to care for the child. And that particular mechanism of taking time off then becomes responsible for a very large pay gap. Now, what's interesting is Claudia Gold and others then thought about the policy implications of this. The policy implications could perhaps be best learned by looking at a subset of this literature where people looked at how women responded to this, especially well-educated women who were potentially ambitious in their careers. One would guess that women who were ambitious in their careers but wanted to take time off to have kids might look for careers where there isn't so much of a penalty. So what they did is they looked at how big the penalty for taking time off when you have kids, or indeed for taking time off for any reason, varied across industries and occupations. For instance, within the medical industry, the amount of career penalty you experience for taking time off to have kids may differ if you're an emergency surgeon versus if you're a radiologist versus if you're a veterinarian. Then they looked at whether ambitious women with very high education were disproportionately choosing professions where the pay gap was small for taking time off. That's what they found. They found that women are disproportionately now choosing professions in which the pay gap is very small. Otherwise, similar people, if you want to take time off to have kids, you're more likely now to choose a profession where the pay gap is small. Now, some of the highest paying professions have variation within them. Within medicine, if you're, for instance, a veterinarian, you are going to be having very little of a pay penalty and career penalty for taking time off, versus if you're a neurosurgeon, you may have a very high penalty. But there are also entire industries where, unfortunately, the gap is still really big for everybody. If you take time off, you're just penalized. One of them is that how many of you are majored in finance? Raise your hand. Okay, so finance is still an unfortunate situation when it comes to this. But we've learned a lesson from this, and that's why I'm really happy that she got the Nobel Prize. What have we learned? The lesson that we've learned is that, in fact, if you can address the pay gap that comes from taking time off to have kids, then you can actually address the gender pay gap. And it is provably possible to address that pay gap for having time to have kids because there are whole occupation categories that have done the work themselves to make things more equal for people who take time off to have kids versus people who don't. So I find this work incredibly exciting. Very little of it required quasi-random variation, although it did require lots of really detailed questions, detailed collection of data for very large groups of people over an extended period of time. Okay, so far so good. Now, another question. What about something else that's unfortunate about the labor market? If you look at America today, everybody does not have what they need. And in some cases, what they don't have is so severe, we would say that they're in poverty. What does it mean in economics terms, in economics policy terms, in data terms, for a household to be in poverty? Does anybody know? Go ahead. Okay, good. So you can imagine if you're under a certain income level, you're in poverty. If not, then you're not. Okay, how do they determine what that income cutoff is? What do you think? Go ahead. Okay, good. So they have to determine some kind of cost of living. They determine some kind of minimum standard whereby if you can consume all of these things, then you've met the minimum standard of kind of doing okay. And if you haven't met that standard of doing okay, we would say you're in poverty. If you have met that standard, you're not. So what they do, and have done since the 60s, is look at your income, then look at the prices of the kinds of goods they think you and your family would need in order to be doing okay. They take the prices within the basket of goods that they think you and your family would need in order to do okay. And what they do is they compare your income to the sum of those prices. If your income's not high enough to afford from your income all those goods, then you're in poverty. If it is higher enough, you're not. Well, let me show you some interesting statistics. If you look at this official poverty measure in the United States, you come up with the following, what is that? Right? Your image is using AI. Okay. The following interesting thing. The official poverty measure started at over 20%. It did decline into the mid-10s, then going back up to 15, big 10s again, 15. But has it changed much since 1970? No. So as a result, Ronald Reagan said a really interesting quote. He said, "We fought a war on poverty, and poverty won." Kind of an interesting quote. According to the official statistics, I would say Reagan was right. We definitely did not decrease poverty much at all. Now that's a little bit strange, because median income in the United States, even accounting for inflation, skyrocketed during this period. We became a much wealthier country by any measure of wealth, whether it's income, the total household wealth of the country, etc. And yet both the official poverty rate and the people who are below 50% of the poverty measure level, which is in the measure of extreme poverty, seems to have stayed constant for decades. How can we explain this? Well, I want to introduce the work of Notre Dame economist James Xavier Sullivan. It's named after one of the Econ. I'm not going to allow that today. Okay. So I'll introduce some of the work of him. And what Jim has done is he's looked at these official poverty measures, but he's also looked at how much people are actually consuming. He's collected data on how much a huge number of people in the United States are consuming, and he's looked at whether that's changed over time. Because the idea is, your income may be low, but your consumption may be high, or vice versa. Someone think of some reasons why your income might be low, but your consumption might be high. Go ahead. Okay, good. Raise your hand if you are currently out of your own pocket paying for every expense you have. Yeah, 153 people in this data set. Not a lot of people raising their hands saying they're paying for every expense they have out of their own pocket. Why? Well, most of you are about 18, and most people who are approximately 18 and going to college are still getting help from their family. Now imagine for a minute your grandparents. Raise your hand if you have any grandparents that are retired. Okay, are your grandparents who are retired earning earned income? Raise your hand if they're literally totally retired. They're not working at all for pay. Okay, are they starving? No. Okay, their consumption is not totally determined by their income. Their labor income doesn't determine their consumption. They in fact have retired and they're living off of their savings, they're living off of Social Security, they're living off of a variety of things. So once you start thinking about it, the exceptions become immense. Very young people, very old people, people who have anything in the bank at all and decide to make use of it. What about people who are making use of government programs? Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. A very large portion of the United States is on the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, SNAP, formerly known as food stamps. A very large portion of the United States is on federal disability. The list goes on. Whether you're getting help from your parents, whether you're getting help from your own savings, whether you're getting help from friends, or whether you're getting help from the federal government, your consumption may not be determined by your income. So he looks at consumption data and tries to see what that tells us over time. What do you think he finds? Do you think that poverty has increased, stayed the same, or decreased? Okay, I gotta vote for decreased. How many people think it's increased? How many people think it's stayed the same? How many people think it's decreased? Okay, so most people are saying decreased. Let's see what he found. This is what he found. Using consumption poverty measure, 31% of the country was poor in 1961. That went down to something like 4.5% around 2010. And it's continued to stay low and decrease. So what we see is that looking at consumption data, we fought a war on poverty, and poverty has not won. We haven't won the war yet either. There's still poverty in our country, but it has drastically decreased. Drastically decreased. So let's try to put together everything we've said so far and ask what we've learned. We learned that indeed there's good evidence that everybody gets paid their value of marginal product of labor. We learned that value of marginal product of labor is plausibly affected by your education. We've learned that other things can affect your pay, such as the availability within your profession of the ability to just live your life and be yourself. But usually those things affect your pay through the inability to live your life impacting your ability to affect your VMPL. It's through the VMPL, but in a very tricky way, right? It's not the kind of discrimination that's saying your pay has nothing to do with your product. It's like, no, your product is low, but your product's low not because you couldn't have a high product, but because people have designed the system such that it's hard for you to live your life and have that high product. Okay, and then finally we've learned that if you look at how much people are consuming, the labor market may not be working great because labor market income would still leave a significant portion of people in poverty. But something is reducing poverty through sharing consumption with everybody. Now, there's a common theme in all of that that will help us see where we need to go. In every one of those areas, I see the specter of economic growth. So how do we afford to give people ever-increasing amounts of education? How do we afford to have such a large portion of the economy devoted to educating people? By the fact that our economy has grown an enormous amount in the last 100 years. You take where the American economy was in 1925 and compare it to 2025, in real terms, our economy has grown so much. Between 1825 and 1925, between 1925 and 2025. Each of those 100-year periods, truly massive growth. And without that growth, there's no way we could afford the education levels that are propping up the pay of the American workforce, because education is expensive. Likewise, gender pay gap. The professions that can afford to be creative about working with people so that they have time off, those are not professions in a slow growth economy or an economy that hasn't experienced a lot of growth, in which there's very little room to experiment or try different structures. These are professions that are taking place within a wealthy country that has the opportunity to experiment and try different structures so that people can both live their lives and be productive in the workforce at the same time. Again, the fact that we've discovered some professions where we can do this comes about because we've experienced economic growth. And if we're going to continue doing that in the future, it's going to require economic growth. How would I connect economic growth to this picture from Jim Sullivan's work? Go ahead.
Could be consumption, poverty, or value the system of representation of numerous growth. The lower
Yeah.
poverty means that
And why? So tell me why. Tell me a story why that would be the case.
if people maybe aren't necessarily earning more, but relative to the cost of living, like have more in the bank or have more assets or something, it means that overall they earn like more money.
Yes. Okay, so there's no way we could have consumption growth, consumption improve so much for 30% of the US population, maybe 15, 20% today, whose labor earnings are so low that they can't support themselves, but some kind of growth must have occurred or be occurring in this context so that the rest of the economy can support them. Whether it's through past growth as distributed through savings or through everybody else currently working, as in Social Security and in other forms of aid. Okay, so we have the direct effect of economic growth on poverty, which is to reduce the number of people who need assistance. Then we have the indirect effect of economic growth, which is to make more assistance available. Both of those things, the direct effect and the indirect effect, have had combined a large impact on poverty. They've greatly reduced it. So then the question now becomes not what causes us to be paid what we're paid, but how do we live in a society that is experiencing a lot of growth? Well, that's what will bring us to the final market of all. But that's for Tuesday. See you then.